Hello friends, welcome back to the channel. Today we are continuing the story, What If Naruto Built His Own Harem with Tsunami, Tsunade, Mikoto, Ayame, Anko, Karin, Hana, Temari, Tsume. This is part 3. If you're enjoying this fanfiction, make sure to smash the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe with the bell icon so you never miss the next part. Alright, let's begin part 3. Naruto woke up the next day, and extracted himself from both Karin and Kin who had taken to sleeping in his bed. Truth be told, he needed to get a bigger home. A relative living with him, and a slave, made his one-bedroom efficiency rather cramped. Naruto took a shower before dressing in the Anbu clothes he had gotten from Mikoto. He would have gotten rid of them, but damned if they weren't comfortable. He headed into the kitchen and quickly cooked up some food for everyone, eating his rather quickly. He had things to do, and an apology to make. Naruto grabbed his mother's sword before heading out. When he saw the beautiful blade, he knew he had to learn how to use it. A crimson sheath, black hilt with a golden star-shaped guard, the black blade had a red edge to it, making it look forever stained in blood. The blade was also twice as thick as any blade he had seen, but figured there had to be a good reason for it. Naruto strapped it to his back once he was outside. He breathed in the air, savoring the smells that filled the morning. He could smell the dango cooking, the ramen from Ichiraku's, and a dozen other scents. It was a pleasant smell to him. He began to leisurely walk towards the hospital, needing to see Jiraiya. He wasn't paying much attention really, letting his feet take him along the path. Naruto. He heard the surprised call of his name and he glanced behind him, seeing Ino in civilian clothes. Oh hey Ino. Naruto stopped and let her catch up. How's it going? Ino looked Naruto over, surprised by the clothes he wore. It made him look rather hot. Oh, it's going alright. You look good in the new clothes Naruto. What happened to the orange jumpsuit? She asked. It was an atrocity to fashion that deserved to be burned and she hoped it was gone forever. Naruto gave a slight shrug. I'd continue wearing it, but these are more durable, and surprisingly comfortable. I'll be back in the orange soon. No. Ino shouted wide-eyed. Sorry, just no, she said more calmly. You look better in the proper shinobi attire, why go back to the orange? I bet you could get Sakura to look at you more. Ino didn't bother mentioning herself. She had eyes for Sasuke, but damn, Naruto really looked good and she would almost seem aroused. Naruto laughed a bit, rubbing the back of his head. You think so? He asked and got a vigorous nod. Well, I'll try to get some more of these types of outfits. How's your training going? Ino shrugged at Naruto's question. I'm taking a break right now. I'm not in the Chunin exam finals, so why bother? She asked. Naruto gave a slight groan as he pinched the bridge of his nose. Ino, Naruto shook his head. Just because you're not in the finals, doesn't mean you shouldn't be training. I guarantee that it will be beneficial in the long run to take your training seriously, now that you're young. You don't have to be a prodigy, but you can be a stronger shinobi. But too much training would kill my figure. Ino said, putting her hands on her hips and shifting her weight. I don't want to be some muscle-bound girl that doesn't have curves. Naruto looked into it. No offense, but what curves? He asked and saw the quick look of anger on Ino's face. He lifted his arm up, blocking Ino's fist from connecting with his head. I'm being serious here Ino. He said and grabbed her wrist as he stared into her eyes. What would you know about it? Ino asked defiantly, her eyes blazing with her fury. Naruto looked at Ino. You admitted to not training, meaning you're not building muscle. You're also known for being on diets, meaning you're not getting a properly balanced meal or the energy needed. Your body has a low percentage of body fat, and a low percentage of muscle. Without either of these, you don't have curves that would allure a guy. Think of Anko, the proctor for the second exam. She had large and wide hips. She's reputed to eat most dango, but because she's a special jonin who works her off training herself, her body has taken some of the fat from the dango and converted it into muscle. There's also a rumor going on about how the size of a woman also shows the amount of chakra she has. Ino looked blatantly shocked at Naruto's words. Her mind went back to the Anko woman and realized that Naruto had quite a point. Naruto saw that Ino was reacting to his words and decided to nudge her a little more. Also look at the Temari girl from Suna. Strong, competent shinobi around our age, and she has curves that appeal to a man. I bet if you were a strong, competent kunoichi, Sasuke would be more than willing to give you the time of day. And, if those aren't good enough reasons, well, I do have a little wager if you're interested. Ino looked a little suspicious at the wager. Alright, what is it? She asked. Naruto shook his head. Not here, meet me at training ground 7 in 2 hours, wear your shinobi gear. He said before releasing Ino's wrist and walking off, heading back to the hospital. Ino was hot, even he would admit that, but damned if she wasn't too skinny for his tastes. He furrowed his brows as he realized the MILFs he banged were having an influence on his tastes. Naruto entered the hospital and immediately set out for Jiraiya's room. He opened the door, seeing the bandaged Sannin already sitting up, and reading a rather thick file. Hey Jiraiya, what's that? He asked. The Sannin looked up. Hey kid, this is the report on the prank you told me about. Jiraiya said. The kid was a certified genius with a dangerous mind for revenge pranks. But Jiraiya wouldn't tell the kid that. Not bad, but I've seen better. Putting gelatin in the fuel tank for the ANBU's generator, making it freeze up in the cold, itching cream mixed with super glue on the masks, laxatives in their water supply, that's child's play kid. Your mom did better. Naruto moved over and pulled up a chair, sitting down in it and looked at Jiraiya before falling down on his lap. I'm sorry, he said softly, in a low whisper. What I've done, especially summoning Gamabunta like that, I shouldn't have done it. I'm sure you have your reasons as to why you couldn't watch over me as a child. Jiraiya set the folder aside and watched his godson. Look, Naruto, if I didn't feel like I didn't deserve the beating to some extent, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Yeah, summoning Gamabunta was pretty petty. But when I summoned the old toad, he would have probably put the smack down on me anyways. Naruto glanced up and nodded. It's just, Naruto sat there for a bit, trying to word his statement. I'm just now hitting my stride in reaching my potential. I had the desire to learn, but no one wanted to teach me until I had lost the dedication. I keep thinking that if you had been there, I would have already been peeking out my potential. Naruto shook his head. Crazy, isn't it? Jiraiya reached over and put a hand on his godson's shoulder. No, it's not crazy, not in the sense you're thinking. And kid, you're a diamond in the rough. The real rough, but a diamond nonetheless, and I'll help you reach your potential, and your dream. Naruto looked at Jiraiya and nodded. Thanks, Ero Sennin, Naruto said with a slight smirk. Damn you Kushina, even now that nickname will haunt me. Jiraiya said, shaking his fist towards the ceiling. Naruto shook his head at his godfather's antics. Look, I came up with some strategy for the exams, and I'm hoping you could help me with it a bit. Naruto said, getting Jiraiya's attention. Naruto then began to lay out all of his ideas that he brainstormed with the Inuzuka women watching his godfather's facial expressions. Jiraiya rubbed his chin. 2 things, against the Uchiha, try not to turn it into a battle of attrition. Get in, beat the hell out of him, and get out. Jiraiya said. Against the Aburame, you're better off using fire. Getting in close is dangerous, he'll put his bugs on you and you'll start having your chakra eaten from your body as he's leaping away to dodge your attacks. Hand me my pack, he said. Naruto grabbed the surprisingly heavy pack and handed it to Sannin. But I don't know anything that has to work with fire except for explosive tags, and no offense but I'm not going to throw an exploding tag at Shino. Jiraiya nodded as he pulled out a scroll and opened it up. He unsealed some thin paper and handed a piece to Naruto. Channel your chakra into it, he said. Naruto held it in his hands, looking it over. With a shrug, he did as he asked, watching as the paper began to split into little squares that quickly got soaked. What the hell? He asked. Jiraiya looked just as surprised. A dual affinity, he said, rubbing his chin. Everyone has an elemental affinity that their chakra wants to sway towards. In fact, training in 2 of these affinities is a requirement for being a Jonin. Special cases are obviously made from time to time, but not often. Your paper cutting itself up means you have an affinity towards wind, and the paper getting soaked also means you have an affinity for water. Which will make learning fire-style jutsu a pain in your. Jiraiya said, shaking his head. Naruto looked at Jiraiya and nodded. So what are your affinities? He asked. Fire and earth. Jiraiya said. Both of my elements beat yours. So, fire, wind, earth, and water. Naruto asked. And lightning. Jiraiya said. Your old man had lightning and wind affinities. He said before he grabbed a second scroll and unsealed a large book. Here, start with this if you plan to use seals in the finals. It was a beginning book on sealing. I'll be out in a week, I want to see progress made, got it? Jiraiya asked. Naruto gave a nod. You got it, Ero Sennin. He said and headed out the window before Jiraiya could retort. Damn you Gaki. Jiraiya shouted after the blonde. Naruto laughed as he landed on the rooftops nearby and began to hop towards his team's training ground. He soon had to take to the trees and quickly hopped on through. Landing in the clearing, he glanced around before he summoned about 100 shadow clones. He felt a little out of breath when he was done, but that wouldn't matter. He then began to divide them up into groups. He double-checked the game book for maybe scrolls on the Mangekyo techniques, or the techniques the Rinnegan might give him. He felt relieved when he received 2 scrolls, and so he had a group of 15 go work on the Mangekyo techniques. They would find a private and secluded training field. He sent a group of 30 to work on the Rinnegan techniques. 10 went to practice the snake style, and another 5 went to practice the Hirishin. He really hoped that it would work. He then split the remaining 40 clones in half, sending 20 to the other side of the training ground to start on the sealing book that Jiraiya had loaned him. The other 20 he had started working on getting used to his mother's sword. He personally leaned against a tree, resting after having created so many clones. He could usually create about 50 or so before he got winded, doubting that he felt the draw on his reserves and wanted a quick break to let them rest up. He supposed because of his ninjutsu skill being so high, it allowed him to create more clones. His hand twitched as he felt 8 clones suddenly dispel, being burnt to death by an uncontrolled Amaterasu. This was going to take some time. After about 2 hours, and sending over 100 more replacement clones out to those learning the dojutsu he had, one of his clones came over to him. Hey boss, Ino is here. The clone said. Naruto opened his eyes and stood up. Alright, head over to some place where you won't get in the way. Naruto said before he headed over to a dumbstruck Ino that was staring at all the clones. Impressed? Naruto asked. Ino jumped and turned to look at him. Yeah, I mean, you've come a long way. You used to not be able to perform a clone, and now you have a few dozen milling about. Why do they look like they are doing the training though? Ino asked. Naruto glanced over at his clones. Their solid chakra constructs Ino. This means they can interact with things unlike the standard clone technique. However, they also use up a ridiculous amount of chakra to make even one. Because I have a ridiculous amount of chakra to spare, I can create them and they can train for me, to an extent. Physical stuff I still have to do, but they could learn a new jutsu or fighting style. Naruto explained. Ino looked amazed, it was impressive to hear. Think you can teach me? She asked. Naruto shook his head. It would kill you, literally, to make just one right now, Ino. Besides, Ji-san made me promise not to teach anyone the move. Wait, Ji-san, I thought you were an orphan. Ino said, crossing her arms. Naruto shrugged. He's more like a surrogate grandfather. Besides, I hate calling him the Sandaime Hokage. Ino's eyes widened. Wait, the Hokage lets you call him Ji-san? She asked, surprised. Naruto nodded. Like I said, surrogate grandfather. He said before putting his sword over by his clones and walking over towards the more spacious clearing. I'm sure you're dying to know about this wager. Naruto said, cracking his knuckles and then his neck before doing some basic stretches. Ino nodded. This better not be anything perverted, Naruto, or I swear I will hurt you. Ino said. Naruto held his hands up. No, Nothing of the sort. He said. I'll just be helping you realize what I was saying was true. If you train more, you'll not only enhance your shinobi abilities, but also your looks. He said. Ino nodded slowly, watching her fellow blonde. And how will this wager do that? She asked. Naruto stood up and entered a loose fighting stance, his hands up ready to protect his head. We fight, he said. Nothing seriously maiming and no killing, but an actual fight. I'll just be using the substitution because I'm a little worn out from making as many clones as I have. Naruto said. If you win, I will take you clothes shopping with all the money I've saved up in doing missions. I have quite a bit saved up, since I don't really buy much except for ramen. All you need to do to win, is land one solid hit on me that wasn't blocked, parried, or otherwise intercepted. Ino nodded, sounded easy enough. What do you get if you win? How do you win? She asked. For the next 2 months, you go on a strict training schedule of my design, including a new diet that will complement it. As for how I win, I just have to completely tire you out until you collapse. Naruto said. Ino nodded. This sounded like an easy win for her. Then let's get this started, she exclaimed before rushing Naruto. Taijutsu really wasn't her forte, but she doubted the blonde would let her get off her family's technique. Naruto ducked under a wide right hand, blocked the left going for his center, leaned back from Ino's second right hand, and twisted to the side to avoid her kick to his legs. It was all very much basic academy stuff, but she made it work. Naruto then stepped in, blocking Ino's left hook towards his face with his right arm and slammed his left fist into her stomach, knocking the wind out of her. Naruto then followed up with a strong kick to her upper thigh, and an open palm thrust to her sternum, forcing her back. Ino panted, trying to regain her breath from Naruto's initial punch. Damn, she had expected an easy win, but Naruto was proving to be a tougher competitor than she had thought. Even worse, he didn't even look winded. She flipped through the hand signs for the basic clone and leapt back, 3 forming and moving around with her, trying to confuse the blonde into which was the real and which wasn't. With her clones, Ino drew 2 kunai and threw them at the blonde. Naruto watched as Ino and her clones threw kunai at him and he performed a quick substitution, watching as they struck the wood. He leapt behind Ino, and swept out her feet from under her, before rolling away as he realized he swept out a clone. Naruto stood up on his hands, and using the increase of acrobatics, he lashed his foot out, connecting with Ino's upper arm. She tried to go for a kick to his arms, but he rolled backwards, away from her. The fight continued similarly for the next 20 minutes. Naruto blocked, dodged, or used the substitution every time Ino came close to hitting him. She was finally laying on her back, panting and sweating in exhaustion. Naruto wasn't any worse for wear. He was breathing a little heavier, but nothing too bad that he couldn't keep going. You give up? Naruto asked. Ino looked up at the blonde that was standing and just flopped her head back down. Yeah, she panted out. Naruto headed over to her and held his hand out to her. He helped her to her feet. Breath in through your nose, out through your mouth, and do that slowly for a few moments, Naruto said. It took a bit for Ino to get her breathing under control. What now? She asked, sounding winded now instead of exhausted. Now we go eat. Ramen will do, it's cheap and quick, he said before he picked up his sword and the beginning book from his clones. They were already done with the book, and he would have to get the next one from Jiraiya. Ino wanted to say something about being on a diet, but her stomach was too cramped at the moment. The thought of food, any food, was making her almost ravenous after the intense workout. She followed the blonde back into the market area of the village, and followed him into the little ramen shop. Hey, Tsukiji-san, 2 bowls of pork, 2 bowls of chicken, 2 bowls of shrimp, 2 bowls of miso, a vegetable, and a spicy please. Naruto called out. Tsuki walked out and saw Naruto. All right Naruto, I'll get them started right away. How about you little lady? What can I get for you? Ino looked at Naruto briefly. 2 bowls of vegetables, she said. Tsuki walked into the back and started cooking the ramen for the 2. Naruto turned to look at Ino for a bit. What are you trying to build? He asked suddenly. hips and thighs, or? He asked, wanting an idea of what to ask Mikoto to help build Ino's training regimen. Ino looked surprised for a moment. Hips and thighs, she said after a little while. She already had Sakura beat in the chest area. Naruto nodded before closing his eyes and just savoring the aroma of the ramen cooking. When Tyuki brought it out, he snapped open the chopsticks and said "Itakitamasu" before starting on the ramen. He watched as Ino ate with a refined dignity, but still seemed like she was starving. Naruto was also surprised when after she was done with 2 bowls, she ordered another 2 and managed to plow through them both before being full. Naruto was gracious enough to pay for them, letting her go back to her house. He told her he'd bring over her schedule the next day. Naruto watched her go away before glancing down at the closed wound on his side from where she got him with a kunai. With the black undershirt, the blood didn't show up and she didn't know she managed to cut him with a kunai. That being said, he felt no need to tell her simply because as a shinobi deception was part of his trade. He'd get her something nice. Naruto stood up once he paid for the ramen and headed back to the training grounds. His clones were done for the day, and had dispelled while he ate. He'd still need a lot more practice, but this month would be perfect. As he arrived at the training ground he cracked his neck a bit. A heavy object struck the back of his head, and he was knocked out. Temari planted her iron battle fan on the ground and sighed as she looked at the Uzumaki kid. She hated what she was about to do, but the Cage's orders were final in this matter. At least he's good looking, kind of flaky though. She then sealed her battle fan in a scroll before casting a genjutsu on the blonde to make him look like her fan. She hefted him up onto her shoulders, grunting a bit as she began to carry him to a utility shed she had found. She made it to the shed without any problems arising, and she then dumped her package on the floor of the shed. She closed and used a silencing seal she bought. No one would hear anything that went on. She then turned to the blonde that was still unconscious. She picked him up and put him into a chair she had brought to the shed and began to tie him to it. Hands behind his back, and feet attached to the legs of the chair. She also made sure he wouldn't be able to use any escape jutsu to get out of it. She stood up and looked at her handiwork and sighed a bit as she pinched the bridge of her nose. Suna had never really cared about Kekkei Genkei. Sure, they had a few, but not as many as Konoha did. Her father, however, apparently felt a desire to get some of the more known Kekkei Genkei. She was originally to get the Uchiha, however with him missing from the village, she was forced to go after the secondary target. One Uzumaki Naruto. Temari still couldn't believe she had to do this, but at the same time she knew her duty as a shinobi of Suna. She knelt down in front of the blonde, realizing she had to degrade herself further for her village. She lowered her head and began to lick the head of Naruto's, drawing it into her mouth and slowly beginning to on it as she moved her tongue around the head. She fondled his balls as best as she could, but she had never done anything like this before. Apparently she was doing something right, taking him to the back of her throat. Despite her initial hesitance, Temari wasn't having too much of a problem. The blonde was quite tasty, and she could take her time and go at her own pace. Naruto felt a rather pleasant sensation tickling his balls. He tried to move his arms, to rub the sleep from his eyes, but felt they weren't moving. His eyes snapped open and he looked down to see Temari on her knees. One hand fondled his balls, the other was under her battle dress squeezing at her. Naruto took stock of his situation. He could see the seal on the door, and knew he wasn't going to be heard. His hands were bound apart with ninja wire. It dug into his skin, so he knew that he would cause serious damage if he chose to struggle. He also had a foreign and, from what he understood of the information from Kin, he thought about why he would be bound and being pleasured, and then it hit him. She was after his seed. No doubt Temari was under orders to get pregnant so that Suna could have more Kekkei Genkei users. Only they would try to take his Kekkei Genkei, which at this point were numerous. Naruto cleared his throat. You know, it's not nice to attack and rape an ally. Naruto said, pretending to be oblivious about the whole invasion. Temari glanced up at the blonde, stroking it a bit. Be a good kid, and be quiet and make this easier on me. Temari said as she stood up. She pulled her hair from the pigtails, shaking it out a bit. She then began to undress, removing the battle dress and the mesh under armor. She straddled the blonde's lap and sighed. She was hoping to save her virginity for a more intimate and emotional event, like with someone she truly cared about. But for Suna and under the Cage's orders, she would give it up for the mission. Naruto admired Temari's body. The toned legs, flat stomach, perky, and even the scars on her hands and arms from her training. Body to stimulate herself. Naruto noticed a resignation on her face, noticed the look of reluctance. "You're a virgin, aren't you?" Naruto asked. Temari's face snapped up, her eyes blazing with anger. "What's the matter? Not like you've had more experience," she said and was about to drop herself on him and get it over with. "Don't move," Naruto said when she was practically sitting in his lap. "Let your body get used to it, wait for the pain to dull before you start moving." He had no idea if it would help or not, but he figured it couldn't hurt to give her some advice that sounded reasonable. Temari nodded and waited until the pain passed. She then rose up, hissing in pleasure and a bit of dull pain. She lowered herself again, her breathing coming out just a touch faster. She began to move up and down on the blonde, running her hands through his hair. Subconsciously, she noted it was surprisingly soft. She did not want to enjoy this, she knew she was practically raping the blonde for her village. She did not want her body to enjoy this and hoped to get it over with soon. Naruto felt Temari's hands slide through his hair and glanced up at her. Leaning in as best as he could, Naruto kissed the top of her, watching as she glanced down at him. She was tight around him, and for the life of him he couldn't help but enjoy the way her thighs felt straddling his legs. He felt her hands tighten on his hair and she raised herself up a bit, arching her back as she pressed her nipple to his lips. Without a word, Naruto locked his lips around the pink nipple and began to slowly, closing his eyes and savoring the taste of the Suna Kunoichi. Temari arched her back as she felt Naruto on her nipple. She didn't want to like this, didn't want to enjoy it, but the blonde wasn't going to make it easy for her. She grabbed his hair tighter and pressed his mouth to her a bit more. Damn it, Naruto winced slightly as he felt her grip his hair tighter. It wasn't exactly a pleasant feeling, or one he was used to often. But, to keep his hair in his head, he began to harden on her nipple, applying pressure with his teeth. He could feel her virgin body tightening around his shaft, and knew she was getting closer to her own orgasm. He closed his eyes to stop focusing on the pleasure of her inner muscles occasionally twitching around his length. Temari lolled her head back, riding the blonde a little harder. Her breath was coming in short gasps as she took Naruto deep into her body. She briefly wondered if she could convince the blonde to forsake Konoha and return with her to Suna. She could see the blonde as her little boy toy, pleasuring her between the missions. Perhaps once Suna and Oto crushed Konoha, she could get him in his time of grief. Temari bit her lower lip before letting out a soft moan as she felt him lick around her nipple. She was close to her orgasm. Naruto rolled his eyes up to watch Temari. He could see that she was close, but was using her training as a shinobi to hold herself back. He really hoped that during the invasion he didn't have to kill her. After all, that would be a lot of potential wasted, something he hoped wouldn't happen. He felt her hands tighter, and her nails dig into his scalp a little bit and winced at the pain. Her cry of pleasure, and the feel of her body tightening up like a velvet vice, however, went a long way to making him feel better. Certainly had nothing on it. She looked down to the blonde a bit, noticing a lack of his own orgasm. She grit her teeth a bit in anger as she began to ride him more vigorously. Naruto was making this a pain in her when she just wanted to get it over with. Was it too much to ask for his cooperation? Naruto felt her riding him with a bit more vigor and anger. He didn't think he was that bad, but she must be pretty upset by the fact she had to do this. Still, perhaps it was his own greed or lust, but he wanted to enjoy her riding him for as long as he could. He mentally smirked as she moaned out, just a little more and a little louder. Temari moaned a bit more as she rode the blonde harder. More nipples. She told him, gripping his hair tighter as she rode him hard enough that the chair squeaked from the pressure. The blonde was going to give her what she needed to complete her mission, and if she had to also make him pleasure her in the process, so be it. Naruto gave another wince before staring up at her, glaring a bit as he put pressure down on her nipple, enough to get her to yelp, in pain. She glared at him, but he returned it. He wasn't going to let her get away with hurting him and not give some pain in return. Temari removed her hands from the blonde's hair and put them on his shoulders, pushing her into his face a bit more as she moved faster. She was getting a little desperate for the blonde to release. She wasn't so bad that he wasn't pleased by it, was she? Making way for his orgasm. Still, he wouldn't have Temari walk away without a second orgasm to prove that he was still good at. He began to fasten on her nipple, pulling with his teeth but not using them for pain purposes. Temari began to breathe faster, feeling the blonde at her nipple much more vigorously. She felt the coil of her orgasm tightening up, like an overworked spring that was ready to snap at any second. Kami, she couldn't pinpoint why she was already feeling like she needed to have an orgasm. As she felt Naruto blow his load inside her, she cried out in her second orgasm, her eyes rolling back into her head a bit from the sheer power of the second orgasm. Naruto felt her slump forward, and stopped her hips and felt her chest rise and fall against his face as her breathing was quite labored. He didn't say anything though, not wanting to make her get off yet. Slowly however, she removed herself from his lap, standing on clearly shaky legs. He saw her wince and noticed a familiar pattern of side effects like what happened with Karin. Temari got dressed, and pulled her hair back into the 4 ponytails, a little messier than what they had been but nothing she couldn't pull off as being from training. She went around behind the blonde, letting Naruto think she was going to untie him. She should kill him, slit his throat and let him bleed to death all over himself so she wasn't caught. But she couldn't bring herself to do that to him. Nonetheless, she needed a head start over Naruto. She unsealed her iron battle fan and bashed him in the back of the head once again, his entire body tensing before going limp. She checked him to make sure he was unconscious. "Sorry kid," she said as she cut his arms and legs loose, this way he could get up when she was gone. She then turned and headed out of the room, needing to find a place to wash the comb off her legs, and the blood off of herself. The last thing she needed was for Gaara to smell the blood. Naruto awoke some time later, groaning as he moved his arms and rubbed the back of his head. The events came back to him and he shook his head. "Son of a bitch," he said slowly standing up. He never had a concussion for very long, but it certainly felt like he had one from being bashed by a big iron fan. Taking stock of his surroundings, Naruto noticed he was still in the same utility shed but was this time free. He put himself away and patted himself down, still feeling his ninja equipment. He sat back down in the chair, rubbing his temples and trying to ease the pain away. Part of him wanted to report Temari, but at the same time he didn't want to see her get punished for doing her duty. If she had been ordered by her village's leader to screw him, then he didn't want her to get stuck between a rock and a hard place. "Damn my bleeding heart," he said as he pulled his game book out. Flipping it open to the level up page, Naruto glanced down and blinked a few times, trying to get the fuzziness to go away. "Congratulations. You had a friendship with Subaku no Temari. Plus 1100 points plus 10 wind elemental manipulation. Congratulations. You received the silver, an enemy kunoichi, medal. Plus 1000 points. Congratulations. You received the bronze, bottomed, medal. Plus 500 points. Congratulations. You received the bronze, foreigner, medal. Plus 600 points. Naruto banked the level up, wondering what some of these medals were. Naruto flipped over the medals, already knowing the enemy kunoichi. He tapped it anyways. Yue Naruto then headed over to the stats and bumped his luck up. Maybe he wouldn't get bashed in the skull if he had better luck. He then flipped over to the skills and watched as the points from Temari floated down. He then looked at his wind elemental manipulation. It was currently at 40, meaning he had a pretty strong wind element to begin with. He decided to bump it up by 61 points, all of his points. Wind elemental manipulation, 101 points. Adept level. The wind is yours to command. Wind-based jutsu are easier to learn and redirect. Naruto rubbed the back of his head before closing the book and putting it away. He got up and headed out, wanting some food and rest. It was finally time. Neji Hyuga would pay for his crimes against his family member, and Naruto's friend, in blood. Naruto put a booted foot up on a chair and tied it tight with jerking motions. He closed his eyes and closed his gloved hand. He needed to calm down. After Temari's actions against him, Naruto hadn't had intercourse with anyone, obviously distressing those he had. He tried to put up a false front, but he was sure Mikoto and Ayame saw through it. He had a lot of anger at himself for what happened. He put that anger towards training, never really letting go of it. He would get his revenge, in time. While with a minor concussion and just waking up, he didn't want her to be punished. He later decided that he did want her punished. Punished a more fitting way, but it would take some time. Naruto grabbed the jacket and pulled it on, before tucking his mother's sword along his back, glancing back at it. During his training, he learned the little secret the sword had, and couldn't wait to see Neji's face when Naruto pulled it out at a key moment. Naruto tucked several scrolls into the pockets of his jacket and pants before running a hand through his hair. He heard a knock at his door and headed over to open it, showing Sasuke wearing a different outfit. This one was black, and with a high collar. Naruto mentally shrugged at it. "I'm ready to go," he said as he walked out of his apartment and locked his door. Sasuke watched Naruto for a bit. His mother would have never lived it down had he been late to the Chunin exams, and so he had decided to get back from his training with Kakashi late last night. He had been so exhausted that he had woken much later than he usually had. Usually he was up at 6 to start training for the day. Today he woke up at 10, giving him 2 hours to get ready for the exams. "Is that Itachi's old Anbu outfit?" Sasuke questioned. He could swear he saw it before. Naruto looked down at it. "Yeah, your mom gave it to me. Said she was going to give it to you, but you weren't there and she remembered that I was wearing that orange jumpsuit," Naruto said before looking up to Sasuke. Sasuke looked Naruto over in the outfit. "It looks good on you, Dobi, more professional," he said. They took to the rooftops, jumping across leisurely towards the stadium. Naruto glanced over, noticing a speed increase from Sasuke. It was impressive, but he wondered how long Sasuke could keep it going for. It didn't matter. If they fought, he would show Sasuke that he had come a long way since being the class Dobi. They dropped down and approached the stadium at a steady pace, Naruto's mind whirling through the plans he made. His ceiling shot through the roof, and he was confident to say he knew more than Jiraiya did. The old hermit would deny it, but Naruto could tell by how Jiraiya got him working on a fire-based ninjutsu. That took him a while, but it would be worth it in the end. Naruto almost let a small smirk spread across his lips. By the 4th week of training, Jiraiya had nothing else to teach him, and so they began to spar. Jiraiya was a great sparring partner. He didn't pull his punches, but lowered himself to a skill level that could help Naruto. Naruto paused at a hallway and summoned a shadow clone, handing the clone a small ceiling tag. Naruto watched the clone take off, before heading into the waiting room. They still had some time before the match would start. Naruto felt his anger flare, seeing Temari, but he beat it down and just stayed away from her. Now wasn't the time. The Naruto clone headed up towards the cage box. There, he waited for Sarutobi to make an appearance before going over to the aged Sandaime. "Naruto-kun, shouldn't you be down with the other contestants?" Sarutobi asked, sounding a little surprised to see the blonde. The clone gave a grin. "I'm just a shadow clone, Ji-san. I wanted to get a hug for good luck, see if that Hokage's wisdom can't rub off on me," Naruto said and headed over to the Sandaime. Sarutobi shook his head at the blonde's antics, and hugged the boy. He felt Naruto's hands slide under the Hokage robes, and against the battle armor he was wearing. "Good luck down there, Naruto-kun." "Thanks, Ji-san," the clone said, patting the Sandaime on the back, planting a Hirishin marker on the Sandaime's armor. "Stay safe up here," the clone said before giving a bit of a salute and dispelling. Sarutobi wasn't a fool, and knew the blonde put something on his armor. There had been a brief flare of chakra after all. He supposed it was possible that the boy had learned his father's signature technique. Jiraiya had told Sarutobi that Naruto had surpassed even the Sanin's skill level in sealing already, plus there were a few Hirishin kunai on display at the Shinobi Academy. If the boy was gifted enough, he could reverse engineer the Hirishin design and utilize it for his own abilities. Even if it wasn't a Hirishin marker, it wasn't hurting Sarutobi, and it was under his robes so it wouldn't be noticed. He seriously doubted the blonde would do anything to hurt him and so decided to just leave it. Naruto shook his head at how his clone planted the marker. Ah well, at least the clone was humorous. Naruto followed everyone else out to the center of the arena, noticing the new proctor. Naruto's brows furrowed at the sight of the Jonin chewing on the Senbon. He wondered what happened to the other proctor. Naruto stood at the left end of the line, beside Shino, and then it was Sasuke, Shikamaru, Neji, Temari, Kankuro, and then finally Gaara. He noticed that the Dosu guy was missing. My name is Genma, I'll be the proctor for the finals. Here's the new line-up. Genma said, holding up a piece of paper. Dosu was missing, and so Shikamaru was facing off against Temari. Other than that, nothing changed. Hold your heads up proudly guys, these people are here to see you. The Sandaime Hokage stood up, ending his brief talk with the Kazekage. Welcome one and all to this year's Chunin exam finals. He called out, silencing the crowd with a jutsu to make his voice louder and able to be heard by everyone. This year we have a wonderful bunch, and we wish them all good luck in becoming Chunin. Let us begin. Sometimes, the best speeches were short and to the point. Genma looked over the fighters. First match, Hyuga Neji vs Uzumaki Naruto, will the fighters stay and everyone else vacate the arena? Naruto stepped away from the group, and watched everyone but Proctor and Neji walk away, heading up towards the fighters' box. Naruto then moved to stand in front of Neji and rolled his shoulders a bit. It was soon time. Rules are the same as the preliminaries, got it? Genma asked, watching the two nod. What I say goes, instantly. He said in a threatening tone. Hyuga Neji vs Uzumaki Naruto, ready. Begin, he shouted, leaping back a little bit. Neji's Byakugan flared to life, the bulges around the eyes acting almost as an intimidation factor. You should give up Uzumaki-san, it is not your fate to win here today. He said. Naruto reached behind his back with his left hand and drew his mother's sword, the low ringing tone of the metal scraping against the sheath and ominous tone. Naruto put his right hand to the blade, and yanked it down feeling the cut through the leather of the gloves he wore as his head began to bleed. Tightening his right hand into a fist, he held it out at Neji. I vowed to win, Naruto said with an emotionless tone as the blood dripped down to the ground. Naruto could feel the cut already healed, and channeled a bit of chakra into the seals that would auto-repair the glove. Naruto realized that using his own blood was not as significant as using Hinata's blood, but he wouldn't make her bleed for such a thing. Neji shifted his right foot forward, and held his hands up in the standard gentle fist stance. Then you shall fall like the loser you are, like the loser that Hinata-sama is. Neji said. Naruto held the sword in his hand, casually to his side as he reached into the ninja pouch on his right hip. He pulled a single piece of paper out, and channeled chakra into it before throwing it at the advancing Hyuga. Neji paused in his advance and closed his eyes, protecting his precious dojutsu. He didn't need his eyes open to see because the Byakugan allowed him to continue seeing. The paper exploded, but not like an explosive would. His Byakugan shut off, as the flash bang tag went off, causing his eyes excruciating pain. Naruto dashed in, having closed his eyes at the last second so they wouldn't take the full brunt of the flash bang. Sure, he was seeing a few spots, but nothing like had he been watching with a dojutsu active or something. Naruto swiped upwards, a splash of crimson being seen as Neji was cut from his right hip to his left shoulder. Nothing major, it was rather superficial and made Neji leap backwards away from the sword-wielding blonde. Naruto stood there, watching as Neji's tan coat got soaked in the Hyuga's blood. Neji grit his teeth from the pain of the cut. It wasn't deep, but it sure did hurt. He opened his eyes and risked his Byakugan once more. He hadn't expected the flash bang, and he sure as hell wasn't expecting the blonde to actually cause him bodily harm. He was expecting nothing more than a poseur with the sword. I won't be using another flash bang. Naruto told Neji. I don't have a need to. I've already cut you, and fighting will only irritate the wound. You'll be slower, weaker, more cautious, and I'll be giving you more cuts as the fight progresses. You can save face now, and give up, or we can continue. Personally, Naruto wanted Neji to continue. He wanted to bleed the Hyuga. Neji's face turned to a scowl. I will not give up. It is fortunate that I won today, Neji said defiantly. He then rushed the blonde once more, refusing to be put on the defensive by the blonde. Naruto moved out of the initial strike, and swiped out with his sword. Neji leaned back from the swipe, and tried for a palm thrust at Naruto's wrist. Naruto lashed out with a spin kick, slamming his foot into Neji's side before he thrust the sword at Neji's shoulder. Neji spun away from the thrust, and hit the sword with his hand, deflecting it to the side like he did with Tenten several times. He then moved in to disable the blonde's arm. Naruto bent out of the way, and came up, taking a swipe once more at Neji, feeling contact as Naruto cut Neji on the side of the head, cutting the headband away and making the side of Neji's face drip with blood. Naruto looked at the revealed seal with barely hidden disgust. As a seal master, seeing such a thing was, well, quite frankly, it was crude and barbaric, and disgusting to no end. Still, Naruto would not feel pity for the Hyuga. Neji reached up to the side of his face, wincing as his fingers touched the blood. He sunk his stance a little lower, and shifted his feet a bit. He knew the Uzumaki would not wait long. This battle would be over soon. Naruto carefully removed the end cap to his sword and tucked it away, reaching for a kunai at the same time with the same hand. He flicked it at Neji, who pivoted to dodge it. Naruto then reached up to the guard of the sword and separated it, watching the four-pointed star come apart without a problem. Naruto then snapped them back together, and flicked the shuriken-shaped guard at Neji, who again pivoted. Neji was unsure what the blonde was doing by removing these parts of his sword. But he stayed on his toes, expecting the worst to happen. He watched as Naruto began to unravel the fabric around the hilt of the sword. He was caught off guard by the blonde rushing forward, with the sword drawn back in a dual-handed position. Neji dodged the left hand coming up, and knocked the blonde's hand away. His eyes widened at the sight of the right hand coming up. A standard battle-ready katana was about 1/4 of an inch thick near the base of the blade, where it would be at its thickest. The sword Naruto's mother used was a little over 1/2 an inch thick at the base of the blade. Through a series of complex seals that Naruto was studying, the blade was able to stay together so long as the pieces of the hilt were still on the blade. When Naruto removed the cap, the guard, and the fabric around the hilt that had the majority of the seals woven into it, Naruto was capable of splitting the sword into 2 identical swords, doubling the amount of danger Neji was in. As evident by the second cut across his chest, forming a bloody X that Neji now had carved into his chest. Naruto let the Hyuga leap back, dripping blood from yet another wound. Naruto glanced at Genma, who was watching with a calculating eye, almost as if trying to decide if he should call the match or not. Naruto directed his gaze back to Neji, watching the Hyuga. Will you give up, or keep losing blood? Naruto asked. Neji snarled. Why do you try so hard, Uzumaki-san? You cannot defy fate. I am hailed as the greatest Hyuga prodigy since the founding of the village. You are a dead last nobody. You failed the academy exam twice, and from my understanding somehow passed after failing a 3rd time. So why do you keep trying against your obvious superior? Naruto watched Neji for a bit before looking behind himself and scratching a line in the ground. Naruto stood right in front of it, holding both swords at his sides. Knock me past the line, Hyuga Neji, and I will tell you why I fight. Naruto said, bringing the swords up into an X across his body. Neji charged forward and suddenly stopped, just outside the reach of the swords. You're within the range of my divination. he said, sinking into a lower stance. 2 points. Naruto dodged the 2 thrusts, cutting Neji in both legs, unwilling to give up the ground he had despite his surprise at Neji closing in so quickly. 4 points. Naruto dodged the next 3, but took a shot in the shoulder. He made sure to give Neji a cut along his bicep in retaliation. 8 points. 5 strikes dodged, 3 struck. 2 in his right arm, a second in the left one, and Neji received a cut to his abdomen horizontally. 16 points. 10 dodged, 3 in his right leg struck true, 2 in his left leg, and 1 in his abdomen. Neji received a cut along both arms, going from thumb up to elbow. 32 points. 15 dodged, 6 to his abdomen struck true, 3 in each shoulder, 5 in his left leg, making it almost give out. Neji received 2 vertical cuts down, from shoulder to hip. Naruto's back foot was beyond the line. 8 trigrams 64, before Neji could finish the comment, Naruto drove his foot upwards, refusing to take any more attacks. Neji's eyes went wide as he fell to the ground, unable to breathe from Naruto's foot driving up into his groin. It was a dirty, cheap tactic, and the glare he tried to give through the tears of pain wanted to convey that sentiment. Naruto spun on his heel and connected his other foot with Neji's head, using his heel so he didn't make the Hyuga's head explode. He watched Neji fly off, collapsing from the loss of blood and the pain of his wounds. Naruto panted some as he watched Neji. "Winner! Uzumaki Naruto!" Genma shouted loudly. Naruto put both his swords up and retrieved the objects to hold them as one. Sheathing his sword, he walked over to Neji on the medic's stretch and he stared down at the Hyuga, placing Neji's headband on his chest. "I fight so others can achieve their dreams. I fight for others. Lee who wishes to be a splendid shinobi without ninjutsu or genjutsu, Hinata who wants to become the Hyuga clan head so that she can remove that disgusting seal from your forehead. I fight to give them that chance, and so they know that they have someone that believes in them. I fight because fate has no hold over those that choose to throw off its shackles, just as Lee and Hinata have done," Naruto said before turning and heading over to the fighter's box, limping a bit as he did so. It started off as a low whisper, but as Naruto got to the entrance to the stairwell, he heard it and smiled. Cheers of his name, applause, the people screaming out for the great match he gave them. It was nice, different, and it sounded great. Naruto headed up to the fighter's booth and looked at Sasuke. "See you in the next round," he told him before moving to sit down and rest. He was in a lot of pain, despite only really being poked by Neji. Naruto closed his eyes and breathed, listening to the crowd as Sasuke no doubt put up an impressive fight. However, when he heard what sounded like 1,000 screaming birds, his eyes opened and he stood up, just in time to watch as Sasuke drove a lightning-covered fist through an orb of sand. Sasuke smirked as he held his hand in the orb, showing that he too was able to penetrate Gaara's defense. The Chidori was an impressive technique, and though he had hoped to not have to use it, Gaara's defense had finally called for it. "Is that it?" Gaara asked, the sand moving him out of the orb and away from Sasuke. In another universe, the Uchiha might have been late, causing Gaara to listen to the voices in his head and become distracted. He might have had to kill fools with disgusting blood that only riled the voices up, and Uzumaki Naruto might not have shed so much blood and satisfying Gaara's own bloodlust for a time. With all these things not happening, Gaara was able to make his defense stronger and even move himself towards the back of the orb, allowing him to move out of it and away from Sasuke's attack. "If that is the extent of your power, Uchiha, then allow me," Gaara said, holding his hand up, palm out and his thumb downwards, his fingers curled. Sand burial. He then began to slowly close his hand, making the sand squeeze down on the Uchiha's arm. Bones could be heard popping, as the Uchiha screamed out in pain. Blood began to soak the sand, and Genma moved to step in. "Chidori!" Sasuke yelled out, shooting the lightning technique to try and loosen the sand. He drew his hand back and fell back, up to his elbow, a blood-broken mess. Gaara looked upset by the Uchiha escaping and moved his sand after the fallen boy. Sand began to crawl up his legs, with Sasuke moving to try and get away from it. But he was exhausted, hitting his current limit on the Chidori. Soon Sasuke was backed into a wall of sand and it encased him. Sasuke had heard about what it did to Lee. Helkiba had said what Gaara had done to the AIM ninja. He swallowed his pride. Proctor, I forfeit. Sasuke shouted, not so obsessed with his own power that he thought he could continue to take on Gaara. Winner. Sabaku no Gaara. Genma shouted, moving to intervene, moving faster when he saw Gaara still applying pressure to Sasuke. Just as Genma started to move, and the Uchiha cried out in pain, a black chain of energy lashed down on the cocoon that surrounded Sasuke. The sand fell apart, like it was nothing as Naruto landed beside the fallen Sasuke, glaring over at Gaara. In either of Naruto's hands were black chains of chakra, much different from the golden ones he used during the preliminaries. Save it Gaara, Naruto said, watching as his fellow Jinchuriki no doubt was pissed at being denied his kill. Gaara glared at the blonde, but turned and began to walk away. He had felt the very chakra in his sand get destroyed. Not absorbed, but destroyed, like it had been blasted away. The blonde Uzumaki was proving to be a better prey than the Uchiha was. Naruto turned to Sasuke as the medics came out. Are you alright? Naruto asked. Sasuke glanced up at Naruto. Fractured arm, maybe broken. Hurts like hell, he winced a bit as he was put on the stretcher. But it hurt worse training with Kakashi-sensei. Watch yourself in the next round Dobi. Naruto nodded and backed away, letting them take Sasuke away. Naruto then turned and headed back to the fighter's box, contemplating on how effective his chains had been. It was something he had been working on, instead of absorbing the chakra, destroying it. It was harder, but more effective. Up in the cage's box, Orochimaru contemplated starting the invasion. He could nab the Uchiha now, when he was weakened, and kill Sarutobi. But at the same time, the Kyuubi brat was showing promise. He could see more if he let the exams continue just a little bit longer. Temari had failed her mission he had sent her on. Kabuto had checked and yet, 3 weeks later she wasn't pregnant. If the Kyuubi brat fought Gaara, then he would be weakened, and he could be captured. He stayed the signal to start the exam. He knew Kabuto would understand his reasons. Naruto stayed back in the corner, listening as Genma called for Kankuro and Shino's match. Naruto narrowed his eyes at Kankuro when he gave up without even stepping foot in the ring. He knew the invasion was going to happen, but couldn't figure out why Kankuro would just give up. As much as Naruto wanted to get right to his match with Gaara, he went over to Shikamaru, who contemplated giving up. Your mom is watching Shika, and I could have sworn she was polishing a cast iron frying pan yesterday. It was a blatant lie. He didn't see Shikamaru's mom at all, but Shikamaru didn't know that. Shikamaru twitched before jumping over the railing, showing more movement than Naruto had seen of the lazy Nara as well. Naruto watched the fight go on. It was boring in a sense. It took a long time, and it was clearly the battle of the mind. It hurt Naruto's head just watching. But as Shikamaru caught Temari, Naruto knew he would have lost to the lazy shadow user. He shook his head as he watched Shikamaru give up, claiming to be out of chakra. Naruto leapt down as Genma called for both him and Gaara. Naruto moved a fair distance away, to where he would be able to make his chakra chains if necessary. Naruto's mind was going at 1,000 miles an hour, trying to figure out what he could do, how he could beat Gaara. He was confident he could, but there were so many unknowns. Still, Naruto calmed himself down, ready for the fight. Semi-finals Round 1. Sabaku no Gaara vs Uzumaki Naruto. Genma called out and looked at the two. Ready. They both nodded. Fight. He then jumped away. Naruto then jumped away from Gaara, surprising everyone, even as Gaara's sand came out. Naruto landed by the closed doors to the arena and pulled out some sealing tags. He slapped them onto the door, in a 3x3 style. Naruto channeled his chakra to the tags. Seal. He said, a basic barrier forming along the seals, making sure no one and nothing could get in or more importantly out. Naruto pulled a dark blue scroll from his chest and flicked it open all the way, showing 10 seals on the paper, the seals done in the kanji for water. Naruto then tossed the scroll into the air, putting his hands into a hand seal. Seals, release. Naruto called out, channeling his chakra to the scroll that was in the air, fluttering. All 10 seals burst open, pouring out a rushing torrent of water like 10 dams being broken. It had taken Naruto 2 weeks, and every source of naturally flowing water in Konoha that he could find to fill the seals up with enough water. He couldn't just go and drain a lake after all, that would be harmful to whatever was living there, so he had to set up a relay that would drain the water from rivers and such in a way that wouldn't be too much water taken. The scroll landed in the water, and the torrent was silenced but not stopped. Naruto had used every precaution he could, to make sure that the scroll would last long enough to empty the water. Already, he could see the confusion on Gaara's face as the water level was already up to their ankles. Naruto put his hands in the Tora hand seal. Water style, liquid bullet. Instead of coming from within, Naruto made the technique come from the water around him. 3 orbs of water shot through the air, aimed at Gaara. Naturally, the sand moved and took the hit, getting soaked as the 3 shots hit it dead on. Gaara frowned as he watched the sand move away, slower than what it usually would. He commanded the wet sand to attack Naruto, and it still moved slowly. Naruto shot out another 3 orbs of water, slamming into the sand and making it break away, too soaked with water to maintain shape. Naruto stayed serious, even at Gaara's furious face. No doubt Gaara figured out what Naruto was planning. The water was up to their knees and still rising, with Genma standing on the water. Gaara hardened his sand, knowing it wouldn't last long in the water. He shot it down and under his feet, before making it rise up, water running off of his sand, taking a lot with him. Still, he had plenty to float on. He commanded the soaked sand up out of the water, and this time made it disperse into particles. He then had to exert his control with his hands, to keep the particles in the air while the water flowed away. Naruto stared up at Gaara, watching his fellow Jinchuriki return his sand. Still, with the water waist deep, Naruto had the turf advantage. Gaara however had the high ground. Naruto would win this, slowly if he had to. Naruto only knew 2 other water techniques though. The hidden mist jutsu wasn't going to help in this match, even if he could use the lack of visibility to his advantage. The second one was purely defensive, and wouldn't work in the situation. Gaara was much in the same boat as Naruto. He wasn't sure how to proceed. Even if he made his sand the densest it had ever been before using it on the Uzumaki, the waist-deep water would allow the blonde to struggle and fight, freeing his legs and waist long enough to get under water and get free from the rest of the sand. But the Uzumaki couldn't throw water jutsu at Gaara. He'd just disperse the sand again into the particles, and bring it back when it had no water in it. Naruto stared up at Gaara debating as the water kept rising. On one hand, he could just use his chakra chains and destroy the sand cloud that Gaara was standing on, but he doubted the boy knew how to swim and the water wasn't stopping anytime soon. Naruto glanced around at the murky water before pulling another scroll from his pocket. He made sure all of his scrolls were waterproof the night before. He unsealed a breather and tucked it into his mouth. He then went under the water, the seals in the breather allowing for the oxygen in the water to move into his mouth. On one hand, Gaara couldn't see him, on the other he couldn't see Gaara. Still, Naruto swam around and soon poked his head up out of the water. Water style, liquid bullet. 3 orbs shot straight up, aimed for the cloud Gaara was standing on. Gaara's shield moved and guarded it, getting soaked in the process. Hyoten, crystal ice mirrors. He called out, and instead of forming a dome, or using the water around him, Naruto concentrated the ice on the soaked sand which began to crystallize, before breaking off and falling into the water, floating a bit. Naruto then quickly dove under the water, Gaara shooting some sand shuriken at him. Gaara tried to draw the sand out of the ice, but it wasn't responding to his call. He tried lifting the entire thing with his chakra in the sand, but it didn't respond to his call. His sand reacted to another 3 shots of water, before the soaked fell, once more frozen. Orochimaru watched as Gaara was systematically taken down. First the unstable Jinchuriki lost the turf advantage, now he was losing his sand. He sent the signal to Kabuto to start the invasion. Naruto paused as a smoke screen enveloped the cage's box, and a genjutsu began to fall around them. He released it and quickly stood up on the water as Temari and Kankuro moved over the water towards Gaara. "Get Gaara out of here!" Baki called out, blocking the Senbon launched at him by Genma. The three headed his words, and quickly took Gaara away while Naruto moved over to Genma. "Orders?" the blonde asked, launching a few shuriken at Baki. Genma looked at the blonde before looking at Tsunade and leaving. "Go get them, kid, stop whatever they're planning." Naruto gave a salute before rushing off. He had a jinchuriki to stop. Naruto dodged out of the way of a blast of air and landed on another tree branch. He stared down at Temari, watching her for a moment. Different battle scenarios ran through his head, each and every one of them more complicated than the last. He slowly exhaled before standing and leaping away from another blast of air. He landed behind a tree trunk and created a shadow clone. The two bolted to either side, moving to flank Temari. "A simple tactic like that won't work on me," Temari yelled out, swinging her iron fan and unleashing a gust of wind at Naruto. The body slammed into a tree and disappeared in a puff of smoke, just as Temari's body was drawn taut against the tree she was standing against, golden chains siphoning off the chakra from within her body. She stared helplessly as Naruto landed in front of her. Naruto stared at the blonde kunoichi and debated internally about killing her. He could, and he could get away with it too, but it wouldn't sit well with him. He could rape her, break her mind and body using his shadow clones and the Tsukiyomi, but that wouldn't sit well with him either. Naruto sighed and shook his head. "I will get you back for what you did to me, Temari, but not today. I have to attend a jinchuriki close to rampaging." Naruto moved to jump away. "Wait!" Temari cried out loudly, struggling against the chains but finding it useless. "Please, please don't kill my little brother," she said. Naruto paused, staring over at Temari. "And if the positions were reversed, would Gaara willingly plead to have me stop from killing you? Would Kankuro even?" Naruto asked, turning to face the older blonde. Temari glanced down. "No, Gaara wouldn't," she admitted. "But I don't want you to kill him, please," Temari said, close to pleading with the blonde. "Why?" Naruto asked, wanting to know Temari's reasons behind wanting him to spare Gaara. He had no intention of killing someone like he was, but that didn't mean Temari knew that. "Because he is my little brother," Temari said. "Despite the violence, the threats, even his bloodlust, I never considered him a monster. I consider what is in him a monster, but not Gaara. Please, spare him," she said, hanging her head, knowing how useless it sounded. Naruto watched Temari before giving a nod, even if she couldn't see it. "I'll spare him," he said before taking off. He had 5 minutes before the chains would dissolve, letting Temari free. He wanted to finish this before that happened. 30 minutes later, he had finally caught up to Gaara and Kankuro, only for Temari to land beside them as well. It was a bit impressive in Naruto's mind that she was able to catch up that quickly. "I'll take Gaara ahead," she told Kankuro, who moved to remove his puppet from his back. Naruto moved to leap past Kankuro, but the damned puppet got in his way, forcing Naruto to leap back. He glanced over at the figure that landed beside him. "I will take him to Uzumaki-san." "Why?" "Because he was meant to be my opponent for the exams." Naruto looked over to the stoic, and usually quiet, boy. "Thanks Shino," Naruto said and moved past Kankuro. The puppet user tried to intercept Naruto, but a barrage of shuriken from Shino made Kankuro move his puppet for defense. Naruto then took off after Gaara and Temari. Naruto continued on running, having been slowed down long enough to give Temari and Gaara a bit of a lead. However, another 30 minutes and he managed to catch up, this time moving to cut them off. Temari moved to buy Gaara some time to leave himself, but Naruto moved in quickly, grabbing her fan with a chain and yanking it from her grasp. A bit petty, but Naruto then used it to bash Temari over the head. Naruto then leapt away, dodging the barrage of sand shuriken from Gaara. Naruto then snapped his chain to life and lashed it through the sand arm coming his way. Naruto stared Gaara down a bit, his mind trying to come up with several different ways to handle this fight. Naruto's mind came up with one option and he rushed ahead. Every fight or flight instinct was screaming at him to flee, to not charge Gaara head-on. Naruto ignored it as he rolled under another sand arm and dodged his way through a second barrage of shuriken. Naruto was now staring at the half-deformed face of Gaara, and into the golden eyes of Gaara's tenant that was taking over. It was a massive gamble but, Tsukiyomi. Naruto called out as he snapped his Mangekyo Sharingan, catching Gaara in the ocular genjutsu. Naruto looked around the world that was Tsukiyomi mixed with Gaara's mind. It had white shifting sands, a black night sky, and a red moon that had his version of Mangekyo Sharingan on it. Naruto didn't want to know what would happen if he stayed on the sand, so a chain shot up beside him and he leapt up onto it, riding it into the air, giving him a better view of his surroundings. The Tsukiyomi was never intended to trap someone like a Jinchuriki, someone that had two minds in one body. So while the dominant personality, i.e. Gaara, the second personality, i.e. the Shukaku, would take over as a defense of the mind. However, the second personality was still trapped within the mind, unless it could break the Tsukiyomi's hold. Naruto caught sight of the Shukaku, staring at the massive tanuki that watched him. Its body was made of the same bone-white sand, but the markings on it, done in a pitch black, were a stark contrast. Yahoo! Finally, someone to kill. Wind style. Drilling air bullet. The Shukaku took in a deep breath of air before slamming his fist against his stomach, driving out the compressed air into a ball 3 times. Naruto cut the chakra he was feeding into the chain and dropped, a second one moving to catch him and keep him above the swirling sands that had a large hand come up to try and crush him. As if Naruto would give the fat tanuki the option. His eyes focused over at the Shukaku, trying to think of a way to get close and beat the creature. Naruto bit his lower lip a bit as he moved around the chain, circling around the Shukaku. Chains of varying sizes burst from the sand as Naruto manipulated them to drive into the body of the Shukaku, limiting its movements and giving Naruto additional chakra as they siphoned off the demonic chakra. He had one idea, it was stupid, asinine, and so left field that it could work. Naruto's chain moved and shot straight from a blind spot, heading towards Shukaku's eye. Naruto's eyes spun with the Mangekyo Sharingan as he continued to ride the chain. His eyes widened a bit as he saw a bunch of hands made from sand shoot up at him. Shinra Tensai. He yelled out just as his eyes switched to the Rinnegan with additional chakra. He pushed outwards, getting a satisfied feel as the sand was blasted away. Now staring at the eye of the Shukaku, Naruto's eyes formed back to the Mangekyo Sharingan. Tsukiyomi. He cried out, hitting the Shukaku with the genjutsu, and prayed it worked. As the world began to fade, he knew it did. A few moments later, Naruto hit Shukaku with it once more, continuing to do this for an entire day in the original Tsukiyomi, thoroughly breaking Shukaku's mind. Naruto was also pretty exhausted from doing it. Naruto then rode his chain away as the sand began to glow a bit, something Naruto wanted very little over in case it was an explosion of chakra. I'm finally free. It was obviously a female voice, and it was less psychotic sounding than the Shukaku, and the sand construct was beginning to fall away. Naruto moved back along his chain, landing in the sand and shielding his eyes a bit to let the glow of energy die down a bit. When it finally did, Naruto's eyes were wide and his jaw slack. The woman was gorgeous, long hair that came down to the backs of her knees, almond-shaped eyes, high cheekbones, full kissable lips, a large and firm bust, flat stomach, wide flared hips, and long shapely legs. She also had 2 ears on top of her head, like a tanuki would have, with a long singular swishing tail. She was also completely letting Naruto see her rather markings all over her body, reminiscent of the markings on the Shukaku. Well, hello there, handsome. The woman said, moving up to Naruto, her hips in full swing, and pressing against his arm, laying her head on his shoulder. I suppose I have to thank you for freeing me from Shukaku. Her voice was sultry, and Naruto could only imagine the woman moaning. Why yes, Naruto said, having to swallow a bit, still trying to get his body under control from the fact that this beautiful woman was rubbing against him a bit. Uzumaki Naruto, he said, managing to say his name without a stutter. Naruto stiffened up as he felt her cup his groin, rubbing a bit. Well, Uzumaki Naruto, I am the Ikibi no Tanuki, the real one. When Shukaku first sealed me inside him, I had no idea he would subjugate my soul like he did. Being a priest, he was able to catch me off guard shortly before he died. Ikibi moved her mouth to Naruto's ear. Get me out of Gaara, and I'll really thank you, she said before biting his earlobe and squeezing his groin quite pleasurably. Naruto shivered a bit at what she did before releasing the Tsukiyomi Genjutsu. He formed two clones, one grabbing Gaara now that they could, the other grabbing Temari and taking them away. Naruto couldn't forget that there was a war going on. Naruto closed his eyes, feeling out for the Hirishin marker. In a yellow flash, he vanished. Naruto arrived and watched as a monkey summon vanished in a puff of smoke. Orochimaru stood over Sarutobi, cursing him. Ji-san. No. Naruto rushed over, with Orochimaru moving away. Naruto slid to his knees, scraping up the knees of the Anbu pants as he slid along the rooftop for a moment. Ji-san, no, 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 Naruto said, shaking Sarutobi a bit, feeling tears well up in his eyes. He couldn't believe that Sarutobi was dead. His mind wouldn't allow it. The blood from his mouth, the bleeding hole, and the bloody sword all shattered that. Kuku, if it isn't Uzumaki Naruto. The snake Sannin said seeing his prey there. Oh how he would love to have that Uzumaki stamina, the chakra levels, and so many other things about Naruto that would be the perfect host. Join me Naruto-kun, join me and I will give you all the power in the world. I'll even bring back your Ji-san. Orochimaru said. Naruto folded Sarutobi's arms over his chest, and looked at the smile of the old man. Naruto rose to his feet, his eyes still downcast at the man he called grandfather. You killed him, didn't you? Naruto asked. It was an old score to settle. Orochimaru said, not going to deny that he had killed his sensei. Why would he? Even without his arms, he could go toe-to-toe with the Jinchuriki and win. Naruto held his right hand out towards the Kusanagi as red chakra began to billow around him, forming slowly around him into the shape of a fox. Bansho Tenin. Naruto said, the sword snapping right up to his hand. Naruto's head rose, showing the Rinnegan, only instead of the purple color they were crimson from the influence of the Kyuubi. I will kill you, Naruto said before dashing forward. Damned Kyuubi brat. Fine, if you won't join me then I'll destroy you, Orochimaru said, dodging a downward slash from the Kusanagi, before spinning around from a claw attack. He used his superior flexibility to duck under the tail, before kicking Naruto in the side. Naruto took the blow and moved around the leg, aiming to hack it off with the Kusanagi that seemed to be moving with him. Instead, Orochimaru moved away, the sword cutting a groove into the rooftop, before Orochimaru kicked Naruto in the head. Naruto rolled with the strike, before moving in a lower stance with the sword. He moved, his body flowing with the snake style he had been learning, as well as his skills with the sword. It wasn't enough, but he was keeping pressure on Orochimaru. Naruto had it with the snake Sannin though. Give me your soul, he shouted, taking a swipe at Orochimaru's head, feeling a twisted sense of satisfaction as he felt the blood as Orochimaru's face was ripped into, with Naruto ripping out a piece of the soul. He had plenty of practice on animals, using them so in case they weren't that missed. A human's soul was different. He also felt a resistance to it, no doubt from Orochimaru trying to keep his soul. Orochimaru knew of the Rinnegan, he knew of its abilities, but he had never expected a brat to have been able to learn such abilities. He knew some of his memories were pulled out, but it wasn't anything that he couldn't relearn. Drop the barrier. We're leaving. Orochimaru kicked Naruto in the sternum before leaping away. Kidomaru covered their retreat with his spider-like abilities and threw the webbing on the Anbu about to give chase. No, Naruto would not let them get away. He held up his left hand, channeling as much chakra into it as he could risk. Bansho Tenin. He yelled out, wanting to reel in the snake to stab him over and over for what he did to Sarutobi. Tsuyu moved in front of the ability, and pushed both Jirobo and Orochimaru forward. She felt her body get tugged, and moved rapidly towards the blonde's outstretched hand. If nothing else, maybe the blonde would kill her and let her be with her friend. Konoha had killed Kin, why wouldn't they kill one of Orochimaru's elite bodyguards? Just kill me, please, she said, looking to the blonde's blue eyes. Naruto's fist tightened around the redhead's top, the Kyuubi's chakra burning a hole into it, but he soon dropped the Kyuubi cloak. His eyes bled a little bit as he dropped the sword and the girl. He would get Orochimaru. He would avenge Sarutobi. But he had to deal with this first. He sighed, feeling tired. I'm feeling really tired. Tsuyu, right? Naruto asked. He had to admit, she looked pretty good. Kintsuchi told me, she's safe and sound, Naruto said before bending down and picking up the sword, staggering a little bit. He closed his eyes, wondering what he got off of Orochimaru, and saw everything there was to know about the cursed seal. How do I know you're not lying? Tsuyu asked. She didn't want her foul mouth to get Kin in trouble. For the safety of her friend, she would do anything. On my honor as an Uzumaki, I swear to you that Kin-chan is safe, Naruto said and looked at Tsuyu. I'm going to have to take you in though. Tsuyu nodded, knowing all about the procedure and all that other stuff. You look dead on your feet, she said, moving to Naruto's left side and sliding under his arm, helping him walk a bit. I'm just tired, Naruto said. Oh, how he was so damn tired, he had used too much chakra. Let me help, Tsuyu said softly. Besides, you're kinda cute for a tree hugger. Naruto shook his head, snorting a bit before reaching up and yanking Tsuyu's cap off, tossing it to the side. There, better, he said. In the aftermath of the invasion, Naruto ended up running around like a chicken with his head cut off, and he doubted he was the only one. The very next day, Naruto tended to Gaara's seal and unsealed Ikibi, who collapsed into his arms. Naruto then placed another seal on Gaara that took a substantial amount of chakra, locked it in the seal, converted it to demon chakra, and used another seal to rapidly regenerate to about the amount of one tael's worth of demon chakra. It was a highly experimental seal, and it ended up working for the purpose. Naruto snuck Ikibi out, before going back to check on Gaara. They then had a long conversation as to why Naruto was so powerful, with Naruto explaining that it was those precious to him that gave him strength. Next thing was dealing with Temari. He had beaten her, and captured her, making her a POW. Thus, he claimed her as a slave. He showed a bit of mercy though, promising to let her go after 6 months and hopefully then they could get off on a better footing. When that little fact came up when Baki and Jiraiya tried to hash out a new treaty, obviously Baki was understandably upset, but there wasn't much he could do about it. Tsuyu had sought asylum, and wanted to live with Naruto. In return, she told Jiraiya everything she knew about Orochimaru, Oto, and how everything was set up, leaving nothing out from the Sannin. Jiraiya had given it to her, despite her rather disrespectful nature in speaking. Gaara had gotten a good glimpse of Naruto's Sharingan, and the Anbu saw Naruto's Rinnegan. When they were questioned, both sides mentioned this. Naruto was asked how he had gotten them, but he managed to squirm his way out of it with half-truths, vague answers, not once identifying how he got the dojutsu, but claiming if he told them then he would lose the ability to use said method to obtain other Kekkei Genkai, rather unlocking them, and making some believe that the Kyuubi was involved. They were wrong, but Naruto didn't see fit to tell them otherwise. Another problem for Naruto was that space was beginning to become a problem. He had 3 slaves, a clan member, Love, and a female Biju living at his apartment. With that in mind, Naruto took all his savings and rented the next 2 apartments and got them furnished, knowing that no one lived in them. Kin and Tsuyu took one, Temari, Karin, and Ikibi took the other. Karin and Kin had both given him some money to help. They had spent the past month working, doing meaningless D ranks so that they had a bit of money to themselves. He needed to get more room and more money quickly. But he was thankfully frugal enough with his money that he had 3 months before he had to pay the rent. The funeral services for the Sandaime Hokage, and the others that died during the invasion, was on the 5th day after the invasion, once they were sure of all the casualties. There were more than they had hoped for, but less than they dreaded. The kicker had been Sarutobi dying, something a great deal of people had been hurt by. Naruto stared at the memorial, people laying flowers on the pedestal with the picture of the Sandaime in his prime. It was at that moment, Naruto realized that he hadn't really known Sarutobi. When it was his turn to walk up, Naruto forewent the flower everyone else had put. It was pouring, giving him plenty of moisture as he held his hand out, a bouquet of flowers made of ice being formed. He put a seal on the ice, knowing they would last until the seal was gone. He then placed the flowers on the pedestal and went towards the crowd once more, the rain hiding his tears. As the concession moved away, Naruto was stopped by Jiraiya. "We're leaving the day after tomorrow to go look for my old teammate, the other one," Jiraiya said seriously. "Pack for about a month-long trip." Naruto nodded before pausing and thinking. "She's going to be the Godime, won't she?" he asked. It made sense, a powerful kunoichi like that, and a senju to boot. Jiraiya nodded. "I know it's your dream kid, but..." Naruto shook his head. "I'm not ready. Not yet," he said before sighing and walking away, going home. Naruto sighed as he pushed his door open and closed it behind him, stripping down to the boxers and flopping down onto his bed. He was still emotionally drained. "Naruto-kun." Aikibi's sultry voice was heard, and he turned his head to look at the beautiful woman. With dark skin, and dark blonde hair, the woman was stunning, her golden eyes seemed a bit worried about him. Naruto sat up and smiled at her. "Hey Ichi-chan," Naruto said and smiled a bit more when she sat in his lap. She wore a rather interesting outfit made from the sand she could manipulate. It was a shoulderless top that went into a pair of flowing pants. It was mostly see-through, except at her and her groin where the material darkened enough to hide most everything from view. "I'm sorry, I've just been..." She shook her head, whipping her hair a bit. She put a finger on his lips. "Shish, don't apologize to Naruto-kun," she said and kissed him. "It's been explained to me. You did everything you could." Naruto nodded and hugged Aikibi, resting his head on her. "These are soft," Naruto said, closing his eyes a bit. Aikibi giggled a bit, stroking his head. "If you'd like, we can try to cheer you up. I still have to properly thank you." A part of Naruto questioned himself about what he could be thinking about, especially so soon after Sarutobi's funeral. A part of him questioned if he was gay, having questioned the with a very smoking hot woman. Naruto looked up at the beautiful woman, who had caused a small panic when Naruto introduced her to the other girls. "Okay," Naruto said. Aikibi stood up off of Naruto's lap and raised her arms over her head, swaying her hips a bit as she turned around, the sand clothing falling off of her body as she moved lower, her round pressing into Naruto's lap. She then began to grind against him, her tail wrapping around his waist. Without standing back up, she turned around again and leaned forward, brushing her cleavage against his chest as she sank lower to her knees. She pulled his boxers off and reached up. Naruto couldn't believe the soft feel of her hands brushing against his, or his sack. Naruto leaned his head back and moaned as he felt her delicate fingers run from the base of his tip, to the top of his sack along the underside of his. She used a feather-light touch and it was driving Naruto insane. "I'm so thirsty Naruto-kun, you'll give me something to drink, won't you?" she asked as she kissed the tip again before going down, taking the blonde into her mouth and pressing her wet tongue against the bottom of his shaft. Aikibi rolled her eyes up to the blonde, still all the way down. She pulled off, pulling him out of her throat and past her gag reflex. She didn't keep her lips locked around his, letting a lot of excess spit run down his shaft. She began to bob her head on and off, not bothered by her own gagging, except for every once in a while she would have to pull off completely to take a break. Naruto stood up during one of Aikibi's breaks and grabbed her hair tighter. "Open wide," he told her. He watched as she opened her mouth wide before he started to thrust vigorously into her mouth, making her go wide-eyed as she gagged a little louder and clenched his thighs. Naruto felt his balls tighten up, his orgasm close. Aikibi closed her eyes, feeling the impending orgasm. One hand left Naruto's thighs and slid between her own, furiously working her clit over. She tried to keep up, using tongue, teeth, and lips to further orally please the blonde, but his pace was just a little out of her reach. She felt him pull out to the tip, just as the hot cum shot out and into her mouth, getting her to moan from the salty taste as she fed on his tip, trying to get more from the blonde. Naruto pulled out of Aikibi's mouth and helped her stand up, just before he bent her over his bed. He moved behind her, grabbing her hips and rubbing his swollen tip against her soaked. "Someone's horny," Naruto commented briefly. Aikibi pushed back against Naruto, digging her hands into the blankets and beginning to moan louder as his pace began to pick up. "That's it, me, she cried out as she felt him going harder. Her eyes widened as she felt his hand hit her. "Spank this naughty bitch Naruto-kun, spank me and me. Punish my horny body." Naruto had been with Mikoto, who had been a rather horny and kinky MILF, but Aikibi was taking the title of being the kinkiest. Kami, her words were getting him more excited and he was using it as an excuse to thrust into her body harder and harder. He slapped her until her tanned skin had a red hue to it, even though she cried out in nothing but pure pleasure. Aikibi's eyes went even wider as she felt him push so deep and her moan got louder. "Yes. Sweet Kami, yes." She felt his speed and power increase even more and her eyes threatened to roll into the back of her head from the pleasure, but she wanted to remain coherent for what she was getting. "Will you two shut up over there?" Kin banged against the wall, shouting a bit and getting Naruto to chuckle. "Don't worry Kin-chan, you'll get your pounding tomorrow," Naruto called over to her in an almost promising way. However, he didn't need everyone to hear him banging the Aikibi, so with that in mind, he reached over to the wall and drew a silencing seal with his chakra, using just his chakra to do so. It distracted him a little bit, but when he was done, he doubled his efforts. Aikibi had been a little put off by his distracted state, even if he kept moving his hips, but the second he doubled his efforts, her body just Naruto moved over, and positioned her legs to hang over his shoulder as he pushed back into Aikibi's wet. Even after all the cum spilled by her and in her, she was tight. But this time Naruto could play a little bit more. He reached up with his right hand and squeezed her as he started in at a fast pace, his fingers playing with her dark nipple. Aikibi whimpered and writhed as she felt the blonde pounding her wet. Every thrust bumped against her cervix and it seemed the blonde was trying to really punish her body like she had asked him to. The feeling of his fingers tweaking her nipple, or digging into the swell of her was really driving her crazy. She shivered as she felt him trace one of the blue markings over her nipple. Naruto was entranced by the way her impressive bust would rise and fall at a rapid pace. Her heavy labored breathing made it quite easy for him to be distracted by her bountiful chest. Naruto shook his head a little bit and grabbed her legs, pulling her body against him a bit, his getting squeezed as her inner muscles gave a few spasms as he thrust deep into her and bumped into a place that was driving her wild. Aikibi reached up with her hands, sliding them along her sides and noticing the blonde following her hands up the swell of her hips, up her ribs into her. She began to squeeze them, moaning louder as she pinched at her nipples. The blonde focused on her as she raised one up and licked around the nipple, making eye contact with the blonde to make it more erotic. She knew what he was thinking about when she licked her nipple. Naruto felt his balls tighten and he grit his teeth as he tried to ride his orgasm out. But watching the Aikibi lick at her nipple, even on it briefly, was driving him wild, more so than her lewd and dirty talking. Finally it got to be too much, and he pushed in deep into her body, raising her hips up off the bed with the force of his thrust. He gave a few groans of pleasure as he filled her with his cum, feeling the hot fluid spill around his shaft and out of her, her own orgasm being triggered by his. Aikibi panted as she came down from her own orgasm. She could still feel her inner muscles spasm from the pleasure. She stretched her legs out and then lowered them on either side of the blonde, now putting him between her legs. "More, give me more Naruto-kun," she panted out, wrapping her arms around his neck and pulling him down for a kiss as she began to roll her hips forward to get more. Naruto panted a little bit, but he grabbed Aikibi's hips as they kissed. He could still taste a bit of himself on her lips, but like in the past that didn't bother him too much. He began to roll his hips to thrust into her still tight body. This was going to be his limit, 4 was usually how much he could get away with without his balls hurting from the taxing of the orgasm. Naruto was no stranger to having his head pressed into the of a woman, by a woman. He knew what the Aikibi wanted, but he felt a little bit of a need to remind her that he was in charge. So, he bit down on her nipple. The insatiable Biju was quite a lewd woman. He briefly wondered if all of them would be like this, but for now he focused back on Aikibi tugging on her nipple with his teeth. Aikibi said lewdly, raking her nails down across Naruto's back. It had been far too long since the last time she had gotten a good like this. She couldn't even remember the last time she had, and she would savor this and milk it for everything she could. She could feel the coil of her orgasm tightening up for a third time, and she loved it. She loved that the blonde had the stamina to keep going. Naruto pulled off the nipple he was biting and looked up at Aikibi's face, watching her expression that showed her state of pleasure. He really wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going, but he would not be outdone, not even by a Biju. He was Uzumaki Naruto, and he left every woman he had ever thoroughly satisfied. Naruto paused for a second, readjusting his position, and dug deep before starting to thrust even harder than he had before, his bed banging against the wall in time with his grunts and the higher-pitched moans of Aikibi. "Oh yes," Aikibi called out, her eyes wide with pleasure as she clung to the blonde, her ankles locked around his waist and her arms pinning his body against hers. "NN Naruto-kun, I'm so close," she screamed out as her orgasm rolled over her and her entire body jerked with the force, her eyes rolling back into her head a bit. Naruto gave his own moan of loud pleasure, his back arching as he thrust as deep into Aikibi as he could and released his load, filling her once more with the hot cum as he felt her nails dig into his back. His own hands dug into the flesh of her hips and thighs as he began to pant a little bit. He pulled out and stood up a little unsteadily. Aikibi rolled over onto her stomach, her knees on the floor again as she looked over at the blonde. "Once more Naruto-kun, please would you like me once more?" She spread her cheeks, showing him the hole he hadn't claimed. "I want you to completely claim my body," she said, wiggling her to entice him. And enticed Naruto was, as any man would be by a heart-shaped wiggling for him. Naruto's earlier fatigue forgotten, he moved forward, rubbing himself against her a bit, noticing her hole was already lubricated from the juices of her. He slapped Aikibi on her, listening to her moan a bit. He began to push his tip into her, giving a low groan as he felt her hold tighten around his shaft. Aikibi winced a little bit as the blonde pushed in. She let go of her cheeks, grabbing the bed as she felt him push deeper. She had asked for it, and she would take it. She moaned a little bit though, as the pleasure began to mix in with the pain. Her body shuddered as the pleasure began to overcome the pain and she put her head against the bed more. Aikibi watched as Naruto began to work in and out of her, steadily growing faster with his thrusts. She moaned as she felt him tug on her tail a little bit, but she moved her hand down, and grabbed the hand at her hip and brought it up to her, holding his hand there as she felt her slowly get stretched out. It was a slower pace than when he had, but it was no less pleasant for her body. Despite having somewhat of a second wind, Naruto knew his body was tired and sore, his abs burning from the workout of Aikibi. Still, he had to lean in a bit as she dragged his hand up to her, having him squeeze the sizable orb. Naruto could hear her moans getting louder. She was on the verge of another orgasm, but he decided to drag it out, going slower and with less strength. He still had his vigor, but he wanted the orgasm to slowly build like a good bonfire that would last all night instead of a quick spurt of fire. Aikibi pushed herself back against the blonde, moaning louder as she writhed in the pleasure she was receiving. The coil of her orgasm grew tighter and tighter, more so than before. She knew it would be a great orgasm, and she was glad she wasn't in charge. She wrapped her tail around behind Naruto's back and held him there, as every thrust made her breath grow shorter and shorter. Her back arched on a particularly hard thrust and she came, screaming in pleasure as her entire body tightened up. Naruto met his own orgasm with the Aikibi, her muscles tightening up more than he had expected and allowing for him to reach his own orgasm. His back arched a little bit as he moaned loud and throatily as he came inside her, holding her close. When he was done, he eased out of her and moved to help her lay on the bed, before laying down beside her, with her at his left. Aikibi slowly traced her fingers along Naruto's stomach, soon tracing the seal with her fingers. She was briefly surprised when Kyuubi started talking to her, but didn't let her surprise be known. She wasn't even upset by what Kyuubi was saying. She laid her head closer to Naruto's shoulder and kissed his neck. Naruto's eyes widened in surprise and a bit of fear before turning to Aikibi, his eyes still wide, but she had a slight smile on her face. "How did?" he asked. "Kyuubi-chan. When I'm in contact with the seal, she can communicate with me. She's seen all that you've seen and done, and she knows you're in this game," Aikibi said and laid her head on his shoulder. Naruto looked a little speechless. "And you're not mad?" he asked a little hesitantly. He was in the arms of a Biju who knew about the perverted game he was in. "Not a tiny bit," she said cheerfully and smiled more. "After all, it's because of this game that I'm no longer bound by either Shukaku or inside a Jinchuriki. Plus, you see this mark?" She showed the bite mark she had received. "That basically means that you can tell me what to do, within reason of course. As long as you treat me fairly well, I'll listen to everything you tell me to do." Naruto closed his eyes. Sarutobi finding out had been a very dangerous problem. Aikibi finding out was an even bigger problem because if the girls found out, then he'd have to be dealing with all the women he knew after his head. That meant no more leveling up, no more getting better. "Can you keep quiet about it?" Naruto asked a little hesitantly. Aikibi nodded. "I'll keep quiet about it, so go ahead and crack that book open, let's see what you got for me," she said and kissed his cheek. Naruto reached over into his nightstand and pulled out the book, sitting up a bit and flipping it open, Aikibi moving to rest her head on his shoulders. "Only 2,500 points. That's cheap. I'm a Biju," Aikibi said a little outraged on Naruto's behalf. "Shush, that's the most I've gotten from one person without a medal attached," Naruto said and redirected his attention back to the book. "Congratulations. You had 25 blowjobs. Plus 2,500 points." Naruto banked the level up and briefly went over the calculations in his head. Yeah, he did have 25 already. "Congratulations. You received the gold top fox medal. Plus 2,400 points." Naruto banked the level up once more. "Congratulations. You received the bronze spurt medal. Plus 1,000 points." Naruto headed over to the perks. Naruto had seen how the sand had worked and tapped it, spending the skill point he had to get it. A scroll popped out, and he put it to the side, for now. Naruto wasn't getting that. He didn't know what his lightning manipulation was. He headed over to the medals and quickly tapped Top Fox. Top Fox, gold. Dominate the Aikibi no Tanuki. He tapped the spurt medal. Spurt, bronze. Have 5 orgasms in one session of intercourse without any support or backlash from shadow clones. Naruto shook his head. Some of these medals sounded impossible. He headed over to the stats page and stared at it, thinking about how he wanted to go about it. He had 15 points to spend. He needed his chakra control and levels up, but his endurance just wasn't cutting it anymore either. He rubbed the bridge of his nose as he thought of a solution. He boosted his endurance up 10 points, putting it at 60 and feeling a bit of invigoration. He then put the last 5 points into his intelligence, bringing that up to 45. He then looked over to his skills. Bonus from Aikibi no Tanuki. The points fluttered down and he looked at his earth manipulation which was at 50 even. He put it at a 75 for now, he could get it higher later. Water manipulation was at 35 points, which was why it showed up on the chakra paper that Jiraiya gave him. Naruto put 65 points to it, bringing him up to 100 there as well. He looked at his fire and lightning manipulations which were at 20 apiece. He put 30 into his lightning manipulation, bringing it up to 50. 20 went into his fire manipulation, bringing that up to 40. Naruto then went back to the perks and selected the magnetic release. Perks added. Naruto scrolled through the list once more, finding them fairly quickly. Iron Sand. You gain the ability to control the iron particles in the sand like the Sandame Kazekage who learned by watching the Shukaku manipulate sand. Requirements. Magnetic release. Naruto wasn't getting either of those for some time, and so decided to just leave them alone. Naruto looked over to the Ikibi who had been quiet. Well, he asked, wondering if she had anything to say. She smiled. Let's get some sleep, she said and pulled him down into her. Life was good. And that's the end of part 3. How did you like this part? Tell me in the comments, which girl is your favorite in Naruto's harem so far? If you want part 4, then please like this video and comment, next part. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. I'll see you in the next part. Take care, bye.